Sometimes life gives you exactly what you need, disguised as everything you don't want. Daniel Reyes learned this the hard way when he inherited a mansion that looked more like a graveyard for broken dreams than a home. The widowed teacher and his 9-year-old son stood before the crumbling house on Elmwood Drive while neighbors laughed from their porches. The roof had caved in, windows were boarded up, and the foundation was split down the middle. Everyone said Daniel was a fool for trying to fix it. But as Daniel worked nights and weekends patching walls and replacing rotted boards, he found something hidden in the basement. A journal with faded pages that spoke of family secrets and buried treasure. What he discovered beneath his broken inheritance was worth $150 million. But the real question wasn't about the money. What would Daniel do when he realized this fortune came with a choice that could change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock beside Daniel Reyes's bed buzzed at 5:30 in the morning, just as it had every day for the past 2 years since Sarah died. He reached across the empty space where his wife used to sleep and silenced the sound before it could wake Miguel. In the dim light filtering through their apartment's thin curtains, Daniel could see his 9-year-old son curled beneath his weighted blanket, clutching the worn stuffed elephant that had belonged to his mother. Daniel padded quietly to the kitchen of their cramped 2-bedroom apartment, stepping carefully around the loose floorboard that creaked near the refrigerator. The coffee maker gurgled to life as he pulled out his lesson plans for the day, spreading them across the small dining table that doubled as his desk, Miguel's homework station, and their craft area. 4th grade mathematics, reading comprehension, and a science unit on simple machines. 32 students at Roosevelt Elementary, most from families struggling just like his own. The apartment felt smaller each morning. Boxes of Sarah's belongings still sat stacked in the closet because Daniel couldn't bring himself to sort through them, and Miguel's therapy equipment took up most of the living room. The sensory swing hung from a ceiling mount that the landlord had grudgingly allowed, and bins of fidget toys and noise-cancelling headphones lined the bookshelf where Sarah's novels used to live. Daniel's teaching salary of $38,000 had been tight when Sarah was alive and working part-time at the medical clinic. Now with her gone, and Miguel's therapy costs mounting, every month felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. The life insurance had covered Sarah's medical bills and the funeral, but little else. Daniel had already borrowed against his retirement fund twice, and his credit cards carried balances that kept him awake at night. Miguel appeared in the doorway at exactly 6:15, wearing his favorite blue shirt with the dinosaur print. His dark hair stuck up in the back, and he carried his schedule card, a laminated sheet with pictures showing his morning routine. Daniel had learned early that Miguel thrived on predictability, and disruptions to his schedule could derail an entire day. "Good morning, buddy," Daniel said, keeping his voice gentle and steady. "Ready for Tuesday routine?" Miguel nodded and walked to the refrigerator, where his visual schedule was magneted to the door. He pointed to the picture of cereal and milk, then to the clock showing 6:20. Everything in Miguel's world had its proper time and place, a precision that Daniel had initially found challenging, but now treasured. His son saw patterns and details that others missed, noticed when pictures hung slightly crooked or when someone changed their usual walking route. As Miguel ate his breakfast, always the same brand of cereal in the same blue bowl, Daniel reviewed the stack of bills on the counter. Electric company notice, second notice from the credit card company, and a reminder that Miguel's occupational therapy session cost $200 that Daniel didn't have. He slipped the bills back into their envelope before Miguel could see the worry lines deepening around his eyes. The walk to school took them through the older part of town, past houses that had seen better decades and corner stores with security bars on their windows. Daniel pointed out flowers blooming in a chain-link fence, a cat sunning itself on a porch step, small, beautiful things that helped Miguel practice noticing positive details in their environment. Other children ran past them on the sidewalk, calling to friends and swinging backpacks, but Miguel preferred to walk quietly beside his father, sometimes humming softly under his breath. Roosevelt Elementary stood like a brick fortress against the morning sky, its windows reflecting the early sunlight. Daniel's classroom was on the second floor, overlooking the playground where he'd spent countless lunch breaks, helping Miguel navigate social situations with other children. The room smelled of fresh crayons and old books, and Daniel had spent his own money decorating it with colorful posters and a reading corner with beanbag chairs. His students began arriving at 7:45, a stream of faces that had become as familiar as family over the months. Maria, whose grandmother packed elaborate lunches with homemade tortillas. James, who struggled with reading but could solve math problems in his head faster than most adults. Aisha, who always asked for extra homework because learning felt like a treasure hunt to her. "Mr. Reyes, my mom says we might move again," announced Kevin, sliding into his desk near the window. His family had moved 3 times since the school year began, following construction work and cheaper rent. "We'll make sure you're all caught up wherever you go," Daniel assured him, making a mental note to prepare a folder of Kevin's work and assessment scores. He'd learned that stability for his students often depended on small acts of preparation and care. The morning flew by in a blur of multiplication tables, reading groups, and the controlled chaos of 28 fourth graders discovering that plants need more than water to grow. During lunch, Daniel sat with Miguel in the resource room, where the noise level was manageable and the fluorescent lights had been replaced with softer bulbs that didn't hurt his son's sensitive eyes. "Mrs. Patterson says I'm good at patterns," Miguel announced, carefully arranging his sandwich into equal squares before eating. "You are exceptional at patterns," Daniel agreed. "What kind of patterns did you work on today?" Miguel described his math worksheet with the enthusiasm he usually reserved for dinosaur documentaries, and Daniel felt that familiar surge of pride mixed with protective worry. His son's mind worked differently, beautifully, but the world wasn't always kind to children who saw things others missed. The afternoon brought parent conferences, 2 meetings with concerned families whose children were falling behind, and the daily struggle of stretching classroom supplies that should have been replaced months ago. Daniel used his own money for art supplies and snacks for students who arrived hungry, expenses that stretched his already thin budget to the breaking point. By 4 o'clock the school had emptied, except for custodial staff and teachers grading. Papers under humming fluorescent lights. Daniel packed up lesson plans and student work, his canvas bag heavy with the weight of other people's children's futures. In the parking lot, his 12-year-old Honda coughed to life after 3 attempts, another expense he couldn't afford to fix. The drive home took them past the nicer neighborhoods where Daniel's teaching colleagues lived in houses with front yards and 2-car garages. He tried not to feel envious of their certainty, their ability to plan beyond the current month's bills. Sarah used to talk about buying a house someday, a place where Miguel could have his own room, and maybe a garden where they could grow vegetables together. Their apartment building squatted between a laundromat and a convenience store, its stucco. Walls painted a shade of beige that seemed designed to repel hope. Daniel carried Miguel's therapy bag up 2 flights of stairs, past Mrs. Chen's door, where the scent of garlic and ginger always made him think of his own grandmother's kitchen from childhood. Miguel settled into his after-school routine with the focused intensity he brought to everything. 20 minutes of sensory input on his therapy swing, followed by homework at the dining table, then quiet time with his collection of smooth stones that he arranged in complex patterns. Only he understood. Daniel graded papers while dinner cooked, red pen moving across worksheets filled with children's earnest attempts to understand fractions and story problems. Each paper represented a small person working to make sense of the world, and Daniel felt the familiar weight of responsibility that kept him working long past reasonable hours. The mail had arrived while they were at school, and Daniel sorted through the usual collection of bills and advertisements. At the bottom of the stack sat an envelope with the return address of Hartwell and Associates, attorneys at law, printed in elegant script on cream-colored paper. Daniel almost threw it away, assuming it was another attempt to sell him legal services he couldn't afford. Something made him pause, perhaps the weight of the paper or the formal way his name was written in careful handwriting across the front. Mr. Daniel Alejandro Reyes, it read, with their apartment address spelled out completely instead of abbreviated. Daniel tore open the envelope carefully, expecting a form letter. The letterhead was impressive, with gold embossed letters and an address in the financial district downtown. But it was the first line that made Daniel sit down heavily in his kitchen chair. We regret to inform you of the passing of Ms. Esperanza Mendoza, who has named you as the sole beneficiary of her estate. Daniel read the letter 3 times before the words began to make sense. Esperanza Mendoza, a name that seemed familiar but distant, like a song heard long ago. Great aunt, the letter said, on his mother's side. His mother, who had died when Daniel was 15 and had rarely spoken of her family's history. The inheritance included a property at 1247 Elmwood Drive, along with all contents, furnishings, and any additional assets associated with the estate. Daniel would need to contact the law firm within 30 days to claim his inheritance, and there were papers to sign, legal processes to navigate. Miguel appeared beside his chair, drawn by the change in routine. What's that paper, Dad? I think, Daniel said slowly, someone we didn't know we knew left us a house. Miguel considered this information with his usual careful attention to detail. Is it a good house? Daniel looked at the address again, trying to place it in his mental map of the city. Elmwood Drive was in the older section of town, not far from Roosevelt Elementary, but in a neighborhood that had seen better days. I don't know yet, buddy, but maybe we should find out. That evening, after Miguel had completed his bedtime routine and fallen asleep clutching his elephant, Daniel sat at his laptop, researching 1247 Elmwood Drive. The property records showed a house built in 1923, last sold in 1954 to Esperanza Mendoza for $8,000. The satellite images revealed a large structure on a corner lot, but the pictures were too blurry to show much detail. Daniel found a few real estate listings for neighboring properties, houses that had been renovated and were selling for prices. That seemed impossible. Even a rundown house in that area would be worth more than Daniel could afford to maintain, but it would belong to them. No more rent increases, no more landlord complaints about Miguel's therapy equipment. He called the law firm first thing the next morning, speaking to a receptionist who scheduled him for an appointment with Mr. Hartwell himself. Thursday at 2 o'clock, she confirmed. And Mr. Reyes, you'll want to bring identification and prepare for some paperwork. Thursday arrived grey and drizzling, the kind of weather that made Daniel's students restless and inattentive. He arranged for a substitute teacher and drove downtown to an office building that made him feel underdressed in his khakis and polo shirt. The law firm occupied 2 floors, with marble surfaces and oil paintings that probably cost more than Daniel's annual salary. Mr. Hartwell was a man in his 70s with silver hair and expensive glasses, the kind of lawyer who inspired confidence just by sitting behind his mahogany desk. Mr. Reyes, he said, standing to shake Daniel's hand, I'm sorry for your loss, though I understand you weren't close to your great aunt. I don't think I ever met her, Daniel admitted. My mother didn't talk much about her family. Mr. Hartwell nodded, as if this was not unusual. Esperanza was a private person. She lived quietly, kept to herself, but she was very specific about her wishes regarding the inheritance. He opened a file folder and withdrew several documents. The property has been in your family for over 70 years. Esperanza wanted it to stay in the family. The paperwork took an hour to complete, signatures and initials on pages of legal language that Daniel barely understood. When it was finished, Mr. Hartwell handed him a set of keys on a simple metal ring. "The house needs work," he said gently. "Esperanza lived there until about 5 years ago, when her health required her to move to assisted living. Since then, it's been empty. You should know that before you decide what to do with it." Daniel drove to Elmwood Drive immediately, following his GPS through neighborhoods that grew progressively quieter and more tree-lined. The house sat on a corner lot behind a wrought-iron fence that had once been painted black, but now showed patches of rust like old wounds. His first sight of 1247 Elmwood Drive took his breath away, but not for reasons he'd hoped. The house was massive, 3 stories of brick and timber construction that might have been beautiful once. Now it looked like something from a cautionary tale. The roof had partially collapsed on the left side, leaving gaping holes where rain had clearly been getting in for years. Windows on the first floor were boarded up with plywood that had warped and split, and the front porch sagged under the weight of rotting support beams. The foundation was the most troubling sight. A crack ran down the center of the house like a lightning bolt, splitting the structure nearly in half. Weeds grew through gaps in the brick steps, and what had once been a garden was now a tangle of overgrown vines and dead roses. Daniel sat in his car for a long time, keyring heavy in, his palm looking at what felt like a cosmic joke. His neighbors from the apartment building had been right to laugh when he'd mentioned inheriting property. This wasn't a house. It was a demolition project waiting to happen. But as the afternoon light shifted and shadows moved across the damaged facade, Daniel found himself seeing something else. The bones of the structure were solid, the craftsmanship visible even beneath decades of neglect. The proportions were graceful, the kind of architectural details that modern construction rarely attempted. Someone had built this house to last, to shelter generations of families. Miguel would love the big windows when they were unboarded, the way light would pour into rooms large enough for his sensory equipment and his stone collections. There would be space for a real workshop where Daniel could build the adaptive furniture Miguel needed, room for gardens and quiet corners. Daniel got out of the car and walked to the front gate. The lock was rusty, but turned when he applied pressure, squeaking open on hinges that hadn't moved in years. He walked up the broken sidewalk, noting each crack and gap, while imagining how it could look with new concrete and careful repair. Mrs. Chen appeared on the sidewalk, having followed him from 2 houses down. She was a small woman in her 80s, who moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate the world through observation and patience. "You the new owner?" she asked, looking skeptically at Daniel's clean clothes and hopeful expression. "I think so," Daniel replied. "I'm Daniel Reyes. I inherited it from my great-aunt." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. "Esperanza was good woman. Quiet, but good. House been empty too long." She gestured at the damaged structure. "You planning to fix it or tear it down?" Daniel looked up at the broken roof, the boarded windows, the foundation that seemed to be holding the building together through stubborn determination alone. "I'm going to try to fix it." Mrs. Chen studied him for a long moment, taking in his teacher's clothes and the determination in his voice. "Going to take more than trying," she said finally. "Going to take miracle." As Daniel drove home that evening, he couldn't shake the image of the house waiting behind its rusty gate. That night, he spread the property papers across his dining table after Miguel had gone to bed, studying plot maps and deed transfers that traced the ownership back through decades. Esperanza Mendoza had lived in that house for over 60 years, watching the neighborhood change around her, maintaining what she could until age made it impossible. The house held the stories of her life, the history of his family that his mother had never shared. Daniel made his decision in the quiet of his kitchen, surrounded by bills he couldn't pay and dreams he'd thought he'd lost with Sarah. They would move to Elmwood Drive. They would make the broken house into a home. The moving truck looked absurdly large, parked in front of the crumbling mansion on Elmwood Drive. Daniel had hired the smallest truck available, but their modest collection of Furniture and boxes seemed lost in its cavernous interior. Miguel sat on the front steps of their old apartment building, methodically arranging his stones in a spiral pattern while Daniel loaded the last of their belongings. "You sure about this, Mr. Reyes?" asked Carlos, the moving company driver, eyeing the damaged house with obvious concern. "That place looks like it might fall down if we sneeze too hard." Daniel hefted Miguel's weighted blanket into the truck, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "The structure is solid, it just needs some attention." Mrs. Chen had come out to watch the proceedings, along with several other neighbors who gathered on their porches with the fascination of people observing a particularly dramatic television show. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood that the crazy teacher was actually moving into the haunted house, and opinions ranged from bemused sympathy to outright bets on how long they'd last. "Dad, what if the house doesn't like us?" Miguel asked as they drove across town, following the moving truck through increasingly familiar streets. "Houses don't have feelings, buddy," Daniel replied, though he understood Miguel's concern. The mansion did seem to loom with a kind of watchful presence, as if it were evaluating its new occupants. But what if it's sad because nobody lived in it for so long? Daniel glanced at his son in the rearview mirror, struck by the empathy in his question. Then maybe we can help it be happy again. The first night in the house tested every parenting skill Daniel had developed over 9 years. The electricity worked sporadically, requiring him to locate the ancient fuse box in the basement and replace blown fuses with spares he'd purchased optimistically. The plumbing groaned and complained, but produced brown water that gradually cleared. After running for several minutes, Miguel's bedtime routine, so carefully calibrated in their apartment, fell apart completely in the echoing spaces of the old house. Every sound seemed amplified, the settling of old timbers, the whistle of wind through gaps in the walls, the mysterious scratching that might have been mice or might have been the house itself protesting their presence. "It's too loud," Miguel whispered, pressed against Daniel's side in the master bedroom where they'd set up both their mattresses on the floor. "All the sounds are wrong." Daniel pulled his son closer, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility mixed with doubt. Had he made a terrible mistake bringing Miguel to this place? In their apartment, Miguel's sensitivities had been manageable with careful environmental controls. Here, in a house that seemed determined to assault his senses, Daniel wondered if his dreams of home ownership had blinded him to his son's needs. The next morning brought their first real crisis. Miguel's morning routine required specific lighting levels and familiar sounds, but the dining room where Daniel tried to set up their breakfast table felt cavernous and strange. The windows were still boarded up, leaving them eating by the dim light of a single overhead bulb that flickered ominously. "I don't like it here," Miguel announced, pushing his cereal bowl away untouched. "I want to go home." "This is home now," Daniel said gently, but even as he spoke the words, he questioned them. The apartment had been cramped and expensive, but it had been theirs. This house felt like an elaborate practical joke, as if they were pretending to live in a museum exhibit of domestic failure. The day's challenges multiplied with mechanical precision. The furnace, when Daniel finally located it in the basement, appeared to be held together by rust and prayer. The kitchen faucet produced water at a trickle, and the refrigerator made sounds like a dying walrus. Every repair seemed to reveal 2 more problems, and Daniel's modest savings disappeared into hardware store receipts with alarming speed. Tom Bradley at Bradley Hardware became Daniel's reluctant mentor in the art of emergency home repair. A man in his 60s with calloused hands and the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible way a house could break, Tom sold Daniel duct tape, fuses, and reality checks in equal measure. "You know what you're getting into with that." "Place?" Tom asked as Daniel loaded yet another cart with supplies. "I remember when Esperanza lived there. Good woman. But that house has been fighting a losing battle with gravity for 20 years. The bones are good," Daniel insisted, repeating the phrase like a mantra. "It just needs some work." Tom's expression suggested he'd heard those words before, usually from people who ended up selling their houses to demolition companies. "You got experience with restoration work?" "I'm a teacher," Daniel admitted, "but I'm good with my hands and I have time." "Time," Tom repeated thoughtfully. "Well, you're going to need plenty of that." By the end of their first week in the house, Daniel had developed a grudging appreciation for the scale of the challenge he'd undertaken. The roof leak had expanded during a Tuesday night thunderstorm, requiring him to position buckets in a complex arrangement throughout the second floor. The electrical system operated according to logic that belonged to an earlier era, and several outlets had simply stopped working without apparent cause. But Miguel, in his careful way, had begun to adapt. He'd claimed a corner of what had once been a formal living room where afternoon light filtered through gaps in the boarded windows to create patterns on the hardwood floor. His stone collection found new arrangements in the ornate built-in shelving, and his sensory swing hung from a ceiling beam that seemed designed to support it. "Dad, there's something different about the floor in the kitchen," Miguel announced during their second weekend in the house. He was lying on his stomach, running his hands across the worn linoleum with the focused attention he brought to textures that interested him. Daniel looked up from the cabinet door he was trying to realign. "Different how? It sounds hollow in this part," Miguel said, tapping with his knuckles. "Like there's empty space underneath." Daniel knelt beside his son and knocked on the area Miguel had indicated. The sound was indeed different. A hollow echo that suggested space beneath the floor. "Probably just the way the subfloor was built," he said, but Miguel's observation stuck in his mind. That evening, after Miguel had gone to bed, Daniel returned to the kitchen with a flashlight and examined the area more carefully. The linoleum was old and cracked in several places, but in the spot Miguel had identified, it seemed to have been cut and replaced at some point. The edges didn't quite align with the surrounding pattern. Acting on impulse that he couldn't quite explain, Daniel worked the edge of a utility knife along the mismatched seam. The linoleum lifted easily, revealing wooden planks underneath. 3 of the planks had been cut shorter than the others, creating what appeared to be a crude access panel. Daniel pried up the cut planks with a crowbar from his growing collection of tools, revealing a gap that dropped into darkness below. His flashlight beam illuminated stone walls and what appeared to be a narrow staircase leading down into the foundation. The basement that Daniel had explored during his first visits to the house had seemed to encompass the full footprint of the building, but this hidden staircase led to a space he hadn't seen. Heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, Daniel squeezed through the opening and descended into the hidden chamber. The room below was smaller than the main basement, but carefully constructed, with stone walls that felt solid and dry despite their age. Daniel's flashlight beam swept across shelves built into the walls, empty now, but clearly designed to hold something important. In the center of the room sat a wooden table, and on that table lay a leather-bound journal. The journal's cover was worn smooth by handling, and the pages inside were filled with careful handwriting in faded blue ink. Daniel opened to the first page and read, "The Private Records of Eduardo Mendoza, 1947. If you are reading this, then the house has chosen to reveal its secrets." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. The journal contained detailed drawings of mechanical devices, mathematical calculations, and what appeared to be architectural plans showing the layout of spaces beneath the house. But it was the personal entries that caught his attention. "They have stolen my life's work and destroyed my reputation, but they cannot steal what I have hidden. The future will vindicate what the present has condemned." Maria grows more worried. "Each day, she does not understand why I spend so much time in the basement, but I cannot tell her the truth. If they knew what I was protecting, they would never let us rest. The prototype is completed and hidden, where only family can find it. Someday, when the time is right, someone will understand what we sacrificed to preserve this knowledge." Daniel Read until his flashlight battery began to dim, then carefully closed the journal and climbed back up to the kitchen. He replaced the floorboards and linoleum, but left them loose for easy access. As he sat at the kitchen table in the darkness, holding the journal in his hands, he felt the weight of discovery mixed with profound uncertainty. Eduardo Mendoza, the name was unfamiliar, but the journal's references to family suggested a connection to Esperanza, to the house, perhaps even to Daniel himself. Whatever Eduardo had hidden in the basement, he'd intended for family to find it. The question that kept Daniel awake until dawn was simple but profound. What had his unknown relative considered important enough to hide for 70 years? The next morning, Miguel noticed the change immediately. "Dad, you look like you found something important." Daniel studied his son's perceptive face, wondering how much to share. Miguel processed information differently than other children, but his insights often proved surprisingly accurate. "I found a book that belonged to someone who used to live here, someone in our family." "What kind of book?" "The kind that tells stories about secrets," Daniel said carefully. "Would you like to help me figure out what it means?" Miguel nodded solemnly, understanding that his father was offering him partnership in something significant. Together, they sat at the kitchen table as morning light struggled through the boarded windows, and Daniel opened Eduardo Mendoza's journal to begin unraveling a mystery that would change both their lives forever. The Roosevelt Elementary Library smelled of old books and floor wax, a comforting combination that had drawn Daniel there countless times over his teaching career. But today he wasn't looking for children's literature or educational resources. He needed help deciphering the journal entries that had consumed his thoughts for 3 sleepless nights. Elena Rodriguez looked up from her computer terminal as Daniel approached the reference desk. She was younger than Daniel had initially assumed. When he'd first visited the library with Miguel, perhaps in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her calm efficiency had made their previous interactions pleasant, but professional, the kind of helpful librarian who could locate any resource but rarely revealed much about herself. "Mr. Reyes," she said with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased to see him, "how are you and Miguel settling into the new house?" "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about," Daniel said, glancing around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. "I need help with some historical research, and I thought you might know where to start." Eleanor's expression shifted to professional interest. "What kind of history?" Daniel pulled out a photocopy he'd made of one of Eduardo's journal pages, showing the careful technical drawings and mathematical notations. "I found this in my house. It belonged to someone named Eduardo Mendoza, and the dates suggest it's from the 1940s. I'm trying to understand what he was working on." Elena examined the page with the focused attention she usually reserved for helping students with research projects. "These look like engineering schematics. The calculations appear to be related to fluid dynamics, maybe water treatment systems." She looked up at Daniel with new curiosity. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Hidden under the kitchen floor. There's a whole journal full of entries like this, along with personal notes that suggest Eduardo was involved in some kind of controversy." "Eduardo Mendoza," Elena repeated thoughtfully. "That name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. Let me check our local history collection." As Elena searched through databases and reference materials, Daniel found himself studying her with new appreciation. Her questions were precise and insightful, suggesting familiarity with research methods that went beyond typical library science. Training. When she pulled up microfiche records from the 1940s city newspapers, her movements had the confidence of someone who'd navigated historical archives many times before. "Here," she said after 20 minutes of searching, "Eduardo Mendoza, civil engineer specializing in water purification systems. There are several articles about him from 1947 and 1948. Her voice grew somber as she read. "It looks like he was involved in some kind of scandal, accusations of patent theft, professional misconduct. His reputation was destroyed." Daniel leaned over her shoulder to read the newspaper headlines. Local engineer accused of stealing corporate secrets, and Meridian Industries wins patent dispute against discredited engineer. The articles painted Eduardo as a disgruntled employee who had attempted to steal proprietary technology from his former employer. But these are just accusations, Elena said, scrolling through the articles. I don't see any follow-up stories about criminal charges or court convictions. It's as if he just disappeared from public record after 1948. The journal entries tell a different story, Daniel said. Eduardo claimed that Meridian Industries stole his work, not the other way around. Elena's fingers paused over the keyboard. Meridian Industries. They're still around, you know. They've grown into one of the largest water treatment companies in the region. That evening, Daniel spread Eduardo's journal across his dining table, while Miguel worked on homework nearby. The entries revealed a progressive story of innovation, betrayal, and desperate attempts to preserve the truth. Eduardo had developed what appeared to be a revolutionary water purification system, something far ahead of its time in terms of efficiency and cost-effectiveness. The personal entries were even more compelling. Had lunch with Richard Meridian. Today, he seemed very interested in my filtration designs, asked many detailed questions. I was foolish to trust him with so much information, but his enthusiasm seemed genuine. Maria thinks I should patent the designs immediately, but Meridian has promised to help me find investors. He says his company has connections that could make this technology available worldwide. They have betrayed me completely. Yesterday, I was Eduardo Mendoza, innovator and engineer. Today, I am Eduardo Mendoza, accused thief. They have taken my designs, filed them under their corporate name, and destroyed any evidence of my original work. Miguel looked up from his math homework, noticing his father's intense concentration. Is that the secret book again? Yes, buddy. I'm learning about Eduardo, the man who used to live in our house. Was he sad? Daniel considered the question, struck by Miguel's intuitive understanding. I think he was. People took something that belonged to him, and he couldn't prove it was his. Miguel nodded, with the serious expression he wore when processing complex, emotional information. Like when Tommy took my special pencil and the teacher didn't believe. Me. Exactly like that, but much more important. The next afternoon, Elena called Daniel's classroom during his planning period. I found something you need to see, she said without preamble. Can you come to the library after school? Daniel arrived to find Elena surrounded by boxes of historical documents, city records, and what appeared to be corporate filings from the 1940s. Her usual neat appearance was slightly disheveled, suggesting she'd been researching with intensity that bordered on obsession. I couldn't stop thinking about Eduardo's story, she admitted. Something about the way those newspaper articles were written bothered me. They were too uniform, too similar in their accusations. So I started digging deeper. She showed Daniel a stack of documents that painted a very different picture of the events from 1947. Corporate memos from Meridian Industries revealed a systematic campaign to discredit Eduardo after he refused to sell his patents to them at a fraction of their value. When he threatened to take his technology to a competitor, Meridian had launched a preemptive legal attack designed to destroy his credibility. Look at this, Elena said, pointing to a memo dated 3 months before the first newspaper accusations. Meridian's legal department was already planning their strategy to claim Eduardo's work as their own. They had inside information about his research, probably from someone he trusted. Daniel studied the documents with growing anger and amazement. They destroyed him to steal his invention, and it worked perfectly. Eduardo's water purification system became the foundation for Meridian Industries' expansion throughout the 1950s and 60s. The company built their entire business model on technology they stole from him. But why didn't Eduardo fight back? Surely he had evidence, documentation of his original work. Elena's expression grew thoughtful. Maybe he did. Maybe that's what's hidden in your house. That evening, Daniel descended into the secret chamber beneath his kitchen with new purpose. Eduardo's journal had mentioned other hiding places, references to the prototype and complete documentation that suggested the journal was only the beginning of what had been preserved. Using the architectural drawings from the journal as a guide, Daniel began examining the stone walls more carefully. What he'd initially taken for decorative masonry revealed itself as carefully concealed storage compartments. Behind a loose stone near the eastern wall, he found a metal box containing rolls of original blueprints, patent applications that had never been filed, and detailed photographs of working prototypes. The technology Eduardo had developed was remarkable even by modern standards. His water purification system used a combination of mechanical filtration, electromagnetic treatment, and what appeared to be an early form of reverse osmosis that wouldn't be commercially available for another 20 years. The efficiency ratings, in his calculations, suggested the system could process contaminated water at a fraction of the cost and energy requirements of contemporary methods. But the most stunning discovery was the final box, hidden behind a stone that required 2 people to move. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved it perfectly, was a working prototype of Eduardo's purification system. The device was compact, elegant, and according to the accompanying documentation, fully functional. Daniel sat in the hidden chamber until well past midnight, surrounded by evidence of a brilliant man's stolen legacy. Eduardo hadn't just been an inventor. He'd been a visionary who had foreseen the global water crisis that was only now beginning to make headlines. His technology could have prevented decades of environmental contamination, saved countless lives, and transformed entire industries. The weight of responsibility settled on Daniel's shoulders like a physical burden. Eduardo had preserved this knowledge for family, for future generations who might be in a position to seek justice or continue his work. But what was a struggling public school teacher supposed to do with technology that could challenge one of the region's most powerful corporations? Miguel found him the next morning still sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by Eduardo's papers and lost in thought. "Dad, you look like when you're grading really hard tests," Miguel observed. "I'm trying to solve a puzzle that's been waiting." 70 years for someone to find the right answer," Daniel said. Miguel studied the papers with his usual careful attention to detail. "Maybe you need help. Maybe you need to find someone who's good at puzzles too." Daniel looked at his son's earnest face, then at Elena's business card lying beside Eduardo's journal. Miguel was right, as he often was about things that mattered. This wasn't a puzzle Daniel could solve alone. He needed someone who understood research, someone who cared about truth and justice, someone who might be willing to help him honor Eduardo's sacrifice. He picked up his phone and dialed Elena's number. "It's Daniel," he said when she answered. "I found the rest of Eduardo's evidence. I think you were right. He was preparing for a fight that he never got to finish. The question is, are you willing to help me finish it for him?" Elena arrived at the house on Elmwood Drive Saturday morning, carrying a laptop bag and the determined expression of someone embarking on a mission. Daniel met her at the front gate, noting how her practical jeans and work boots suggested she'd come prepared for more than library research. "I've been thinking about Eduardo's story all week," she said without preamble. "If what you found is authentic, this isn't just historical injustice. It's ongoing corporate fraud." Daniel led her through the house, past Miguel's carefully arranged living space, and into the kitchen, where the hidden entrance waited. As they descended into the secret chamber, Elena's sharp intake of breath confirmed what Daniel had hoped, that someone else could see the significance of Eduardo's preserved legacy. "This is extraordinary," she whispered, examining the prototype with hands that shook slightly. "Do you realize what this technology represents? Even today, water purification systems this efficient would be revolutionary." Daniel spread the patent. Applications across the wooden table, pointing to dates and signatures that proved Eduardo's original authorship. According to these documents, Eduardo filed preliminary patents for every component of this system 6 months before Meridian Industries claimed to have invented it. Elena photographed each document with methodical precision, her training as a librarian evident in her careful handling of the aging papers. But there was something else in her intensity, a personal investment that seemed to go beyond professional. A curiosity. "There's something I need to tell you," she said finally, setting down her camera. "My grandfather worked as an engineer in the 1940s. His name was Roberto Rodriguez, and according to family stories, he was involved in some kind of controversy that destroyed his career. I never knew the details, but the timeline matches Eduardo's." "Yes, exactly." Daniel studied her face in the dim light of the chamber. "You think your grandfather knew Eduardo?" "I think my grandfather might have been the inside source that Meridian used to steal Eduardo's work," Elena said quietly. "My family never talked about why we moved away from the city when my mother was young, but there were always whispers about something shameful that had happened, something that made my grandfather drink too much and refuse to work as an engineer ever again." The weight of generational guilt hung between them in the stone chamber, connecting their families across decades of silence and buried truth. Daniel reached for Elena's hand, offering the comfort of shared understanding. "If that's true, then maybe we're both here for a reason," he said. "Maybe it's time to finish what our families started." They spent the weekend cataloging Eduardo's hidden archive, discovering layer after layer of evidence that painted a devastating picture of corporate theft and systematic cover-up. Eduardo had been meticulous in his documentation, preserving not only his original designs, but also correspondence that revealed the scope of Meridian's betrayal. The most damaging document was a letter dated 3 weeks before the first newspaper. Accusations, written by Richard Meridian himself to Eduardo. In it, Meridian acknowledged that Eduardo's technology was far superior to anything currently available, and promised to ensure your innovations receive the recognition and compensation they deserve. "This is proof of intent," Elena said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Meridian knew exactly what he was stealing and from whom. Miguel wandered down to the chamber Sunday afternoon, curious about the adult's intense focus on the old papers. His unique way of processing information led him to notice patterns that Elena and Daniel had missed. Subtle codes in Eduardo's handwriting, mathematical relationships between seemingly unrelated calculations, and what appeared to be a secondary layer of information hidden within the technical drawings. "Dad, these numbers don't match," Miguel announced, pointing to a discrepancy in one of the blueprints. "See how this measurement changes in the different drawings, but the pictures stay the same." Elena examined the drawings Miguel had identified, her researcher's mind immediately grasping the implications. He's right. Eduardo was using the technical specifications to hide additional information. These aren't just blueprints, they're a coded message. Working together, they began to decode the hidden layer of Eduardo's documentation. The message that emerged was both a confession and a warning, written for future family members who might someday need to understand the full scope of what had been stolen. "I have preserved not only the technology, but also evidence of other innovations that Meridian has claimed as their own." The decoded message read, "They have built their empire on the stolen work of many inventors, not just myself. The financial records and corporate correspondence hidden in the Eastern Chamber will prove their pattern of theft spanning decades." Elena's laptop showed search results for Meridian Industries' current operations, revealing a company that had grown into a multi-billion-dollar corporation with contracts throughout the region. Their water treatment facilities served hundreds of thousands of customers, and their political influence extended to city councils, state environmental agencies, and federal contracting offices. "Look at this," Elena said, scrolling through recent news articles. "Meridian is facing multiple lawsuits over water contamination incidents. Communities in 3 different counties are claiming that Meridian's treatment systems have failed, leading to widespread health problems. Daniel read over her shoulder, noting dates and locations that seemed to form a pattern of neglect and corporate irresponsibility. If Eduardo's technology had been developed properly, these contamination incidents might never have happened. It's worse than that, Elena said grimly. If Meridian has been using stolen inferior technology all these years, they're not just guilty of theft. They're responsible for environmental damage that could have been prevented. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor to the house on Elmwood Drive. Daniel was preparing for school when a black sedan pulled up to the front gate, and a man in an expensive suit emerged carrying a leather briefcase. He appeared to be in his 60s, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having his requests treated as commands. "Mr. Reyes," the man said as Daniel opened the front door. "My name is Richard Meridian III. I'm the CEO of Meridian Industries, and I believe we need to talk." Daniel's blood chilled as he recognized the family name from Eduardo's journal. This was the grandson of the man who had destroyed Eduardo's life, now standing on the same doorstep where Eduardo had once planned his futile defense against corporate theft. "I'm sorry, but I'm on my way to work," Daniel said, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. He didn't want Meridian anywhere near Miguel, and he certainly didn't want to give the man any opportunity to see inside the house. "This won't take long," Meridian said, with the practiced smile of someone who rarely encountered refusal. "I understand. You've inherited some property that might be of interest to my company. We're always looking for development opportunities in this neighborhood." "The house isn't for sale," Daniel replied firmly. Meridian's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I think you should consider our offer before making any hasty decisions. This area is undergoing significant changes, and properties that don't adapt to market demands often find themselves facing unexpected challenges." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who had made similar offers many times before. Daniel felt a surge of the same protective anger that Eduardo must have experienced when his life's work was stolen from him. "I said the house isn't for sale," Daniel repeated, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Meridian handed him a business card with gold-embossed lettering. "Think it over, Mr. Reyes. I'll be in touch." As the black sedan drove away, Daniel realized that their research into Eduardo's hidden legacy had attracted attention from quarters they hadn't anticipated. Someone at Meridian Industries was monitoring property transfers, watching for any sign that Eduardo's secrets might surface after 70 years of successful burial. That evening, Daniel, Elena, and Miguel gathered in the hidden chamber to plan their next steps. The discovery of Eduardo's eastern chamber had yielded financial records that proved Meridian's pattern of theft extended far beyond Eduardo's case. Documents showed at least 6 other inventors whose work had been appropriated through legal manipulation, intimidation, and corporate espionage. "We have enough evidence to expose everything," Elena said, organizing the documents into categories of evidence. "But we need to be strategic about how we proceed. Meridian has unlimited resources and decades of experience covering up their crimes." Miguel, who had been quietly arranging Eduardo's prototype components in precise patterns, looked up with the serious expression he wore when processing complex problems. "Dad, what if the bad people try to hurt us like they hurt Eduardo?" Daniel knelt beside his son, choosing his words carefully. "That's why we're being very careful, buddy. That's why we're working with Elena and making sure we have all the facts before we do anything. But we're still going to help Eduardo get his story told, right?" Daniel looked at the prototype that Eduardo had hidden for 70 years, waiting for family to discover and vindicate his stolen legacy. Miguel's question cut to the heart of everything. The choice between safety and justice, between protecting what they had and fighting for what was right. Yes, Daniel said finally. We're going to help Eduardo tell his story, but we're going to be smart about it. Elena smiled at the determination in Daniel's voice, recognizing the moment when moral obligation transformed into active commitment. Then we need to document everything, make copies of all evidence, and find allies who can't be intimidated or bought by Meridian's influence. As they worked late into the night, organizing evidence and planning strategy, Daniel felt the weight of Eduardo's legacy settling on his shoulders like a mantle passed down through generations. Eduardo had trusted that someday someone in his family would have the courage and resources to finish the fight he'd been forced to abandon. Daniel intended to prove that trust hadn't been misplaced, even if it meant risking everything he and Miguel had built in their new home. The hidden room behind the false wall in the basement revealed itself only after Miguel noticed that his father's measurements of the foundation didn't match the interior dimensions of the house. It was Miguel's methodical approach to understanding spatial relationships that led to the discovery of the concealed entrance, triggered by pressing a specific sequence of stones that Eduardo had marked with nearly invisible scratches. Daniel squeezed through the narrow opening with Elena close behind, their flashlight beams revealing a space that took their breath away. Eduardo's workshop had been preserved in perfect condition, protected by the dry air and careful construction that had kept moisture and pests at bay for 7 decades. The room contained workbenches lined with precision tools, shelves holding glass beakers and metal components, and most remarkably, several working prototypes of Eduardo's water purification technology in various stages of development. Each prototype was more sophisticated than the last, showing Eduardo's progressive refinement of his revolutionary design. "This is like finding Einstein's hidden laboratory," Elena whispered, running her fingers along the edge of a workbench where Eduardo's tools lay exactly as he'd left them. "Look at the precision of this equipment. Some of these instruments are more advanced than what we use today." Daniel discovered a collection of keys hanging on hooks behind the main workbench, each one labeled with careful handwriting that identified different chambers throughout the property. Eduardo had created a network of hidden spaces, each one designed to preserve a different aspect of his life's work. The first key opened a chamber beneath the front porch, accessible through a trapdoor hidden under rotting floorboards. This space contained Eduardo's personal correspondence, including love letters to his wife Maria and heart-wrenching diary entries documenting his growing despair as Meridian's campaign against him intensified. "My beloved Maria grows more frightened each day," one entry read. "She begs me to abandon the fight, to take her away from this place where our name has become synonymous with dishonor. But how can I explain that running away means letting them win forever?" Elena found financial records that revealed the devastating cost of Eduardo's legal battles. He had spent his life savings attempting to prove his case in court, selling family heirlooms and borrowing against his property to pay. Lawyers who ultimately advised him that Meridian's political connections made victory impossible. The second key unlocked a chamber in the basement's eastern wall, where Eduardo had hidden documentation of Meridian's broader pattern of theft. Files dating back to the 1930s showed how the company had systematically identified promising, independent inventors, cultivated relationships with them, and then used inside information to file competing patents that invalidated the original work. "They didn't just steal from Eduardo," Elena said, examining corporate memos that detailed Meridian's acquisition strategy. "This was their entire business model. They built their company by destroying smaller inventors who couldn't afford to fight back." Daniel found a photograph tucked inside one of the financial ledgers, a formal portrait of Eduardo and Maria standing in front of the house when it was new, their faces radiant with hope and pride. Eduardo wore a suit and tie, his arm around Maria's waist, both of them looking toward a future they believed would reward hard work and innovation. The contrast between that hopeful image and the desperate man revealed in Eduardo's later writings was almost unbearable. Daniel could see his own struggles reflected in Eduardo's story, the financial pressure, the desire to provide for family, the growing awareness that powerful forces were aligned against ordinary people trying to build better lives. Miguel appeared at the entrance to the workshop, having grown curious about his father's prolonged absence. His reaction to the preserved space was immediate and profound. He moved through Eduardo's equipment with the same careful reverence he showed for his own collections, understanding intuitively that this was a sacred place where important work had been done. "Dad, this person was like me," Miguel announced after examining Eduardo's meticulous organization system. He needed everything to be in the right place. He thought about how things fit together. Elena looked up from the documents. She was cataloguing, struck by Miguel's observation. "What do you mean, he was like you?" Miguel pointed to the precise arrangement of tools, each one outlined on the workbench in white paint, so Eduardo would know exactly where it belonged. He needed patterns. He needed things to make sense. His brain worked like mine, Daniel felt. A rush of understanding that connected Miguel's neurodivergent processing style to Eduardo's methodical approach to invention and documentation. Eduardo's attention to detail, his need for systematic organization, and his ability to see patterns others missed. These weren't just personality traits. They were neurological gifts that had enabled revolutionary innovation. "You're right, buddy," Daniel said, kneeling beside his son. "Eduardo's brain worked like yours. That's probably why he was able to invent things that other people couldn't imagine." The third key opened a chamber beneath the back stairs, where Eduardo had stored his most ambitious plans, designs for water treatment systems that could serve entire cities, agricultural applications that could transform farming in arid regions, and portable units that could provide clean water in disaster zones. The scope of his vision was breathtaking, encompassing solutions to problems that wouldn't become critical for decades. "Look at the dates on these designs," Elena said, pointing to blueprints labeled Emergency Response Unit, 1948. Eduardo was anticipating humanitarian crises that didn't occur until the 1990s. His portable systems could have revolutionized disaster relief. Daniel examined designs for what Eduardo called community-scale systems, treatment plants designed to serve neighborhoods like the one where they now lived. The calculations showed these systems could process contaminated water at a fraction of the cost of conventional plants, making clean water accessible to low-income communities that Meridian's expensive systems couldn't serve profitably. This technology could solve the water crisis affecting half the communities in our county, Daniel realized. Meridian has been charging premium prices for inferior treatment, while Eduardo's designs could provide better results at a tenth of the cost. Elena's research had revealed the current scope of Meridian's operations, and the contrast with Eduardo's vision was stark. Where Eduardo had designed systems to serve the greatest number of people at the lowest possible cost, Meridian had built a business model based on artificial scarcity and premium pricing that kept clean water out of reach for struggling communities. The fourth key unlocked Eduardo's most personal sanctuary, a small chamber where he had preserved family photographs, his wedding ring, and letters from colleagues who had believed in his work before Meridian's campaign destroyed his reputation. This space felt like a shrine to the life Eduardo had lost when his career was destroyed. Among the personal items, Daniel found a letter addressed "To my family who will come after." The envelope was sealed with wax and Eduardo's handwriting. On the outside read, "Open only when you are ready to finish what I could not complete." Daniel held the letter with trembling hands, understanding that opening it would commit him irrevocably to Eduardo's cause. Elena stood beside him, and Miguel leaned against his father's arm, all three of them recognizing the weight of the moment. "We ready?" Daniel asked, looking at Elena and Miguel. Eduardo waited 70 years for someone to find this, Elena said quietly. I think we owe him the courage to read his final message. Daniel broke the wax seal and unfolded pages covered in Eduardo's careful handwriting. If you are reading this, then my hidden chambers have revealed their secrets to family who can understand their significance. I pray that the world you inhabit is more just than the one that destroyed my dreams, but I fear that powerful men like Richard Meridian are not easily changed by time. I have preserved not only my inventions, but also evidence of crimes that extend far beyond my personal tragedy. Meridian Industries built their fortune on stolen innovation, but their greater crime is the suffering they have caused by withholding technology that could have prevented countless deaths from waterborne disease and environmental contamination. The prototype in my workshop is fully functional. The financial accounts I established contain resources sufficient to continue this work independently. But most importantly, I have documented every detail of Meridian's criminal enterprise, creating an archive that can destroy their empire if presented to authorities who cannot be bought or intimidated. My beloved Maria died, believing that I was a failure, a man whose pride led to our family's ruin. She never knew that I chose to appear defeated rather than risk her safety by continuing to fight openly. Now I entrust this burden to family who may have the strength I lacked and the resources I was denied. Use this legacy wisely. The technology belongs to humanity, not to corporations that would hoard it for profit. The truth belongs to history, not to men who would bury it to protect their crimes. But above all, remember that justice delayed is not justice denied. It is simply justice waiting for the right moment to emerge. Your devoted ancestor, Eduardo Mendoza. Elena wiped tears from her eyes as Daniel finished reading. He chose his family's safety over personal vindication. He let the world think he was guilty to protect Maria from retaliation. Miguel, who had been listening with his characteristic intensity, spoke with unusual clarity about emotional complexities. Eduardo was brave in a different way. He was brave by being quiet and waiting. That evening, they tested Eduardo's prototype using water samples from Miguel's school, where recent testing had revealed contamination levels that exceeded safe standards. The device worked exactly as Eduardo's documentation promised, reducing pollutants to undetectable levels while requiring minimal energy input. This single unit could provide clean water for an entire school, Elena said, watching the clear, purified water flow from the device's output valve. Imagine what Eduardo's community-scale systems could accomplish. Daniel felt the weight of possibility settling alongside the burden of responsibility. Eduardo's hidden legacy wasn't just about seeking justice for past wrongs. It was about preventing future tragedies that Meridian's inferior technology couldn't address. But as they prepared to leave the workshop that night, Daniel noticed something that chilled him. Fresh scratches around the lock mechanism of the chamber door and footprints in the dust that hadn't been there that morning. Someone else had been in Eduardo's hidden workshop, someone who now knew exactly what Daniel and his family had discovered. The water purification prototype sat on Daniel's kitchen table like an artifact from a more hopeful future, its brass fittings and precisely machined components gleaming under the overhead light. 70 years after Eduardo had assembled it by hand in his secret workshop, the device still functioned with mechanical perfection that put modern systems to shame. Elena arrived early Saturday morning with testing equipment borrowed from the university's environmental science department, where she had convinced a graduate student to help them analyze the prototype's effectiveness. Her connections at the UR library had proven surprisingly extensive. A network of researchers, professors, and activists who shared her passion for uncovering historical injustices. "I've been thinking about what we discovered yesterday," she said, as she set up the testing apparatus. "The footprints in Eduardo's workshop, the signs that someone else has been inside. Meridian must have known about the inheritance when you received it. Daniel poured contaminated water samples into the prototype's input chamber, watching as Eduardo's filtration system began its work with quiet efficiency. How is that possible? The inheritance was handled through a law firm. It should have been private. Property transfers are public record, Elena explained. Meridian probably monitors all real estate activity in this neighborhood, especially involving the Mendoza property. They've had 70 years to perfect their surveillance of anything connected to Eduardo's legacy. Miguel sat at the table with his mathematics workbook, but Daniel could see him listening intently to their conversation. His son had developed an uncanny ability to process complex adult discussions while appearing to focus on routine tasks, a coping mechanism that allowed him to absorb information without feeling overwhelmed by direct attention. The testing process took 4 hours, with Elena running multiple samples through various contamination scenarios. The results were consistently remarkable. Eduardo's prototype removed 99.7% of all pollutants while using less energy than a household coffee maker. Modern water treatment facilities, including those operated by Meridian Industries, achieved similar purification levels only through processes that required 10 times more energy and produced significant toxic waste. This isn't just better technology, Elena said, studying the data printouts. This is transformative technology. If Eduardo's designs had been developed commercially, they could have prevented most of the water contamination crises of the past 70 years. Daniel reviewed financial documents that Eduardo had hidden in the Eastern Chamber, discovering bank accounts that had grown through decades of compound interest to a total value of nearly $150 million. Eduardo hadn't just preserved his technology. He had ensured that his inheritors would have resources to develop and distribute it independently of corporate control. He planned for everything, Daniel realized. The hidden workshop, the preserved prototypes, the financial resources, even legal documentation that proves his original authorship. Eduardo created a complete foundation for continuing his work. Miguel looked up from his workbook with the focused expression he wore when processing important connections. "Dad, if Eduardo's machine makes water clean and the bad company's machines don't work as good, why doesn't everyone use Eduardo's machine?" The innocent logic of Miguel's question cut to the heart of corporate power structures that most adults accepted without question. Elena exchanged glances with Daniel, both of them recognizing that Miguel had identified the fundamental moral issue underlying their discovery, because the bad company doesn't want people to know about Eduardo's machine, Daniel explained. They make money selling their machines, even though Eduardo's work better. But that's lying, Miguel said, with the moral clarity that often made adult ethical compromises seem unnecessarily complicated. Yes, buddy. That's exactly what it is. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that confirmed their worst fears about Meridian's surveillance capabilities. Daniel was in the backyard helping Miguel practice throwing a baseball when a woman in a professional suit approached through the front gate, carrying a clipboard and wearing a smile that seemed practiced rather than genuine. "Mr. Reyes, I'm Jennifer Walsh from the County Health Department. We've received reports of potential water contamination in this neighborhood, and I need to inspect your property for compliance with safety regulations." Daniel's instincts, sharpened by days of uncovering corporate conspiracy, immediately recognized the visit as suspicious. "I wasn't aware of any contamination reports in this area. Can you show me your identification?" Walsh produced credentials that appeared official, but something in her demeanor, the way her eyes scanned the house's exterior, her questions about recent renovations and basement access, suggested motives beyond routine health inspection. "I'll need to examine your basement and any storage areas where contaminated materials might be present," she said, stepping toward the front door without waiting for invitation. "I'm sorry, but this isn't a convenient time," Daniel replied firmly. If you'd like to schedule an appointment, you can call me during normal business hours. Walsh's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing frustration that seemed disproportionate to a routine inspection delay. Mr. Reyes, I have authority to examine any property where public health might be at risk. I strongly advise you to cooperate voluntarily. Miguel appeared beside his father, having noticed the conversation's tense undertones, despite being unable to hear specific words from across the yard. His presence seemed to remind Daniel that cooperation with suspicious officials could put his son at risk. As I said, this isn't a convenient time. Please call to schedule an appointment. After Walsh left, clearly dissatisfied with her inability to gain access to the house, Daniel called Elena with growing concern about the escalating pressure from Meridian's agents. They're getting desperate, Elena said when she arrived that evening. Your refusal to sell the property, combined with our research activities, has convinced them that Eduardo's secrets are being discovered. But how do they know what we're doing? We've been careful not to discuss our research anywhere except inside the house. Elena's expression grew troubled. I think we may have underestimated Meridian's resources. Corporate surveillance has become sophisticated since Eduardo's time. They might be monitoring our communications, tracking our movements, even listening to conversations inside the house. The possibility that their private discussions had been compromised sent a chill through Daniel that had nothing to do with the evening air. Everything they'd discovered about Eduardo's legacy, every plan they'd made for exposing Meridian's crimes, might have been reported directly to their enemies. What do we do? Daniel asked. We accelerate our timeline, Elena replied. We finish, documenting Eduardo's evidence and go public before Meridian can stop us. They spent the weekend working with urgent intensity, photographing every document in Eduardo's archive and creating multiple copies stored in different locations. Eleanor's network of academic contacts provided secure digital storage and backup, systems that would make the evidence impossible to destroy, even if Meridian gained access to the original documents. Miguel proved invaluable in the documentation process, his attention to detail ensuring that nothing was missed or misfiled. His systematic approach to organizing information seemed to channel Eduardo's own methodical spirit, creating order from decades of hidden materials. Miguel's brain works exactly like Eduardo's, Eleanor observed as they watched the boy create detailed inventory lists with obsessive precision. The same attention to patterns, the same need for systematic organization. Eduardo's neurodivergent traits weren't limitations. They were gifts that enabled revolutionary innovation. On Sunday evening, as they completed the final stages of evidence preservation, Daniel received a phone call that confirmed their suspicions about Meridian's escalating surveillance. The caller identified himself as Dr. Robert Kim from the university's Environmental Science Department, the professor whose graduate student had helped test Eduardo's prototype. Mr. Reyes, I need to warn you about something, Dr. Kim said, his voice tense with concern. Earlier today, representatives from Meridian Industries visited my office asking questions about water treatment research being conducted with equipment borrowed from our department. They seemed to know specific details about testing procedures that only someone with inside access to our lab could have provided. Daniel felt his stomach tighten with the realization that their activities were being monitored more closely than they'd imagined. What kind of questions were they asking? They wanted to know who had borrowed testing equipment, what kind of samples were being analyzed, and whether our department had been approached by individuals claiming to possess proprietary water treatment technology. They also made it clear that the university's research funding could be affected by our answers. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Meridian's financial influence extended to academic institutions, giving them leverage over researchers who might otherwise support efforts to expose corporate wrongdoing. Dr. Kim, I appreciate the warning. Are you in any trouble because of your students' help with our testing? Not yet, but I wanted you to know that Meridian is actively investigating your activities. Whatever you're working on, they consider it a serious threat to their interests." After ending the call, Daniel sat in Eduardo's kitchen, feeling the weight of 3 generations settling on his shoulders. Eduardo had faced the same corporate power, the same systematic pressure designed to silence inconvenient truths. The difference was that Daniel wasn't facing this battle alone. He had Elena's research skills, Miguel's unique insights, and most importantly, 70 years of Eduardo's careful preparation for this moment. "They're scared," Elena said when Daniel told her about Dr. Kim's warning. "Meridian wouldn't be applying this kind of pressure unless they knew we'd found something that could destroy them." Miguel looked up from his evening routine of arranging stones in precise patterns, his young face serious with understanding that went beyond his years. "Dad, are we going to keep helping Eduardo, even if the bad people try to stop us?" Daniel knelt beside his son, seeing Eduardo's determined spirit reflected in Miguel's earnest eyes. "Yes, buddy, we're going to keep helping Eduardo, and we're going to be very, very careful while we do it." Outside, the autumn evening settled over Elmwood. Drive with the quiet persistence that had protected Eduardo's secrets for 7 decades. But tomorrow would bring new challenges, as Meridian's escalating pressure forced Daniel to choose between safety and justice, between protecting his son and honoring his family's legacy. Elena's hands trembled as she placed the genealogy documents on Daniel's kitchen table, her face pale with the shock of discovery that had kept her awake for 3 nights running. The research that had begun as historical curiosity about Eduardo's fate had led her down an unexpected path through birth records, marriage certificates, and adoption files that revealed a truth neither of them had anticipated. "Daniel, I need to show you something that changes everything," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the magnitude of what she'd uncovered. "I've been tracing Eduardo's family line, trying to understand why Esperanza left the house to you specifically rather than to other relatives." Daniel set down his coffee cup, noting the unusual tension in Elena's demeanor. Over the weeks of working together to document Eduardo's legacy, he'd come to recognize her different moods, the focused intensity of research, the quiet satisfaction of solving historical puzzles, the controlled anger when discovering evidence of corporate wrongdoing. This was different. This was personal revelation that cut deeper than academic discovery. "What did you find?" he asked. Elena spread the documents in chronological order, creating a visual timeline that traced family connections across 4 generations. Eduardo and Maria had a daughter named Carmen, born in 1925, when Eduardo's reputation was destroyed, and the family faced financial ruin. Carmen was forced to leave school and work to support her parents. Daniel studied the birth certificate and school records that painted a picture of a young woman whose educational dreams had been sacrificed to corporate greed. Carmen Mendoza had been an exceptional student, particularly gifted in mathematics and science, but Meridian's campaign against her father had reduced the family to poverty that made continued education impossible. Carmen married young to a man named Roberto Reyes, Elena continued, pointing to a marriage certificate dated 1946. They moved away from the city immediately after the wedding, probably to escape the shame associated with the Mendoza name after Eduardo's professional destruction. Daniel felt a strange disorientation as Elena guided him through records that traced his own family history. "Reyes is my family name, but my grandparents died when I was young. I never knew much about their background. Carmen and Roberto had a daughter named Isabel in 1951, Elena said, placing a birth certificate beside the marriage record. "Isabel Reyes, your mother." The documents seemed to blur as Daniel processed the implications of Elena's research. Isabel Reyes had been his mother's name, but she had died when he was 15, taking most family history with her to the grave. His father had remarried and moved away, leaving Daniel with few connections to his extended family and little knowledge of his heritage beyond the immediate past. "You're saying that Eduardo was my great-grandfather?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that Eduardo Mendoza was your mother's grandfather, which makes you his great-great-grandson, and the direct heir to everything he preserved in this house." Elena placed the final document on the table, adoption papers that revealed the truth about Isabel's childhood. "But there's more. Isabel was raised by adoptive parents after Carmen died young. Your mother grew up never knowing about Eduardo's legacy or the inheritance that was rightfully hers." Miguel wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the unusual tension in the adults' voices. He studied the papers spread across the table with his characteristic attention to patterns and details, his young mind processing information in ways that often revealed connections others missed. "Dad, these papers have our name on them," Miguel observed, pointing to the signature line on Isabel's birth certificate where Roberto Reyes was written in careful handwriting. "Yes, buddy. These papers show that we're part of Eduardo's family. The man who built the secret workshop was your great-great-great-grandfather." Miguel considered this information with the serious concentration he brought to complex ideas. "So Eduardo was waiting for us to come back home?" The simple clarity of Miguel's understanding cut through the legal complexities and genealogical research to the emotional heart of their discovery. Eduardo hadn't left his legacy to distant relatives or legal strangers. He had preserved it for his own bloodline, for descendants who would carry his genetic gifts for innovation and his moral obligation to seek justice. Elena pulled out additional documents that revealed the full scope of Eduardo's planning. "Look at this," she said, showing Daniel a will dated 1949 that had never been filed with probate court. Eduardo specifically designated his inheritance for direct descendants of the Mendoza line, to be held in trust until family members are found who possess both the capability and moral courage to continue this work. The legal language was complex, but the intent was clear. Eduardo had known that his children and grandchildren might be forced to hide their connection to his disgraced name, so he had created mechanisms to preserve his legacy until family members emerged who could reclaim it safely. Esperanza knew, Daniel realized. She knew about the family connection when she left me the house. That's why the inheritance was so specific, why it came with no conditions, except that I claim it personally. Esperanza was Eduardo's daughter-in-law, married to his son Miguel, Eleanor explained. She spent 70 years waiting for the right moment to reveal Eduardo's secrets to family who could handle the responsibility. The revelation that Miguel shared a name with Eduardo's son felt like another piece of a cosmic puzzle falling into place. Daniel looked at his son, seeing not just the boy he'd raised, but a carrier of family traits that stretched back through generations. The attention to detail, the need for systematic thinking, the ability to perceive patterns that others missed. "There's something else," Elena said, her voice growing softer with the weight of personal confession. "My genealogy research revealed the truth about my own family's connection to this story." She placed a final set of documents on the table, showing birth records and employment history for Roberto Rodriguez, Elena's grandfather. Roberto worked as an assistant engineer at Meridian Industries in 1947. He was the inside source they used to steal Eduardo's designs. Daniel stared at the employment records that proved Elena's grandfather had been present in Meridian's engineering department during the exact period when Eduardo's patents were being appropriated. The betrayal that had destroyed Eduardo's life had been enabled by the man whose granddaughter now sat at Eduardo's kitchen table, fighting to restore his legacy. "My grandfather never spoke about his work at Meridian," Elena continued. "According to family stories, he quit abruptly and refused to work as an engineer ever again. He spent the rest of his life drinking heavily and talking about shame he couldn't explain to his family." Miguel, who had been listening with unusual intensity, spoke with the moral clarity that often surprised adults. Elena's grandfather felt bad because he helped the bad people hurt Eduardo. But Elena is helping us fix it now. The simple accuracy of Miguel's assessment revealed the redemptive possibility hidden within generational guilt. Elena's research had been driven by more than academic curiosity. She had been unconsciously seeking to understand and atone for her grandfather's role in destroying Eduardo's life. Roberto Rodriguez died, believing he was a coward who had betrayed a good man for corporate money, Elena said, tears forming in her eyes. He never knew that his granddaughter would someday have the chance to expose the truth he'd been too afraid to reveal. Daniel reached across the table to take Elena's hand, understanding that their partnership in uncovering Eduardo's legacy had been shaped by forces larger than chance or shared interest. Two families whose histories had been intertwined by corporate crime were now working together to seek the justice that had been denied to previous generations. This changes our legal position completely, Elena said, wiping her eyes and returning to practical considerations. As Eduardo's direct descendant, you have unbreakable inheritance rights to everything he preserved. Meridian can't challenge your ownership of the property or the technology through legal manipulation. Daniel studied the genealogy documents that proved his connection to Eduardo's bloodline, understanding that his inheritance was more than property and money. It was a legacy of innovation, persecution, and carefully preserved hope for future justice. It also explains why Richard Meridian III has been so aggressive about acquiring the property, Elena continued. The Meridian family has known for 70 years that Eduardo's descendants might someday return to claim their legacy. They've been monitoring property transfers and family records, waiting for this moment. The systematic surveillance they'd experienced, the pressure from false health inspectors, the threats disguised as business offers, all of it represented Meridian's desperate attempt to prevent Eduardo's evidence from reaching family members who couldn't be intimidated or bought. But now they know we've found everything, Daniel said, thinking about the signs of intrusion in Eduardo's workshop and the escalating pressure from corporate agents. They know we have the evidence to destroy their empire. Elena nodded grimly, which means they'll stop trying to buy us off and start trying to silence us permanently. That evening, as Daniel tucked Miguel into bed in their temporary bedroom setup, his son asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. Dad, are we going to be safe now that we know we're Eduardo's family? Daniel sat on the edge of Miguel's bed, choosing his words carefully. We think being Eduardo's family means we have a responsibility to finish what he started, even if it's dangerous. But it also means we're not alone in this fight. Miguel nodded with the serious understanding that had characterized his response to every revelation about their inherited legacy. Eduardo was waiting for us to be brave like him. As Daniel sat in Eduardo's kitchen that night, surrounded by evidence of corporate crime and family connection, he felt the weight of generational responsibility settling on his shoulders like a mantle passed down through bloodlines. Eduardo's persecution had scattered his family and hidden his legacy, but his careful planning had ensured that someday descendants would emerge with the resources and moral courage to seek justice. The fight that Eduardo had been forced to abandon was now Daniel's to continue, with stakes that extended far beyond personal vindication. The water contamination crises affecting communities throughout the region, the environmental damage caused by inferior technology, the ongoing corporate theft from inventors who lacked resources to fight back, all of it could be addressed if Eduardo's legacy was restored to its rightful place in history. But first, Daniel would have to survive Meridian's final desperate attempt to bury the truth along with Eduardo's family. The legal documentation portfolio spread across 3 dining room tables, pushed together in Eduardo's kitchen, represented 70 years of carefully preserved evidence, organized now with the methodical precision that both Eduardo and Miguel shared. Elena had worked through the night, scanning, copying, and cataloging every document, creating a comprehensive case file that could withstand corporate legal challenges and media scrutiny. We have enough evidence to prove 3 distinct criminal enterprises, Elena said, organizing the materials into color-coded sections. Patent theft spanning 4 decades, environmental cover-ups that cause preventable health crises, and ongoing corporate fraud that has defrauded investors and customers of billions of dollars. Daniel studied the portfolio's contents with growing amazement at Eduardo's foresight. Not only had his great-great-grandfather preserved evidence of crimes committed against him, but he had continued gathering documentation of Meridian's other victims throughout the 1950s and 1960s, creating an archive that revealed the full scope of corporate malfeasance. Eduardo spent 20 years after his public defeat, quietly investigating Meridian's operations. Daniel realized he never stopped fighting, he just changed tactics. Miguel sat at his own small table nearby, arranging Eduardo's prototype components in precise patterns while listening to the adults' planning session. His autism gave him the ability to process complex information while appearing to focus on routine tasks, a skill that often provided insights others missed. "Dad, what happens to all the people who got sick from dirty water when we tell everyone about Eduardo's machine?" Miguel asked without looking up from his work. The question cut to the heart of their moral obligation. Elena's research had identified dozens of communities affected by water contamination that could have been prevented if Eduardo's technology had been available. The human cost of Meridian's theft wasn't just financial. It was measured in preventable illness, environmental damage, and lost lives. "We're going to help them understand what happened to them," Daniel replied. "And we're going to make sure Eduardo's technology gets used to fix the problems that Meridian's bad machines couldn't solve." Elena received a phone call that afternoon from Dr. Robert Kim at the university, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Mr. Reyes, I need to inform you that Meridian Industries has made formal complaints to the university administration about unauthorized research being conducted with borrowed equipment. They're claiming that proprietary technology has been stolen and tested without proper authorization." "What does that mean for your position?" Daniel asked, understanding that Elena's academic connections were being targeted as pressure points. "It means Meridian is trying to isolate you from potential allies in the scientific community. They're using their financial influence to cut off your access to resources and credible witnesses who could validate Eduardo's technology." The systematic pressure campaign extended beyond academic institutions. Tom Bradley at the hardware store called to warn Daniel that city inspectors had visited his business, asking questions about materials sold for unauthorized construction projects at the Elmwood Drive property. Mrs. Chen reported that several neighbors had been approached by well-dressed strangers asking about suspicious activities at the old Mendoza house. "They're trying to turn the community against us," Elena observed, as reports of corporate surveillance accumulated throughout the week. "Meridian wants to isolate us socially and professionally before we can build support for exposing their crimes." But Meridian's pressure campaign had an unexpected consequence. It attracted attention from journalists and activists who recognized the pattern of corporate intimidation. Elena's contacts in the environmental movement began reaching out with offers of support, legal resources, and media connections that could amplify their story beyond Meridian's ability to suppress. "There's something you need to know about media strategy," said Maria Santos, an investigative journalist who had covered corporate environmental crimes for 15 years. She had driven down from the state capital after Elena contacted her through mutual connections in the academic community. "Meridian has spent decades perfecting their crisis management response," Maria explained as she reviewed Eduardo's evidence. "They have lawyers, public relations firms, and political connections that can discredit or silence most opposition. But they're vulnerable to one thing: comprehensive evidence presented simultaneously across multiple platforms. Maria's experience with corporate cover-ups had taught her that companies like Meridian could survive piecemeal revelations by controlling the narrative and attacking sources. But a coordinated release of overwhelming evidence, supported by credible witnesses and working prototypes, could create media momentum that exceeded corporate damage control capabilities. We need to plan a press conference that reveals Eduardo's a complete story in one devastating presentation, Maria advised. Patent theft, environmental cover-ups, current contamination crises that could be solved with Eduardo's technology. Everything at once, with visual demonstrations that prove the technology works better than Meridian's systems. Elena coordinated with academic allies to arrange laboratory testing that would provide independent verification of Eduardo's prototype's effectiveness. Dr. Kim, despite pressure from university administration, agreed to provide scientific analysis that would meet journalistic standards for technical claims. "I've spent my career studying water treatment systems," Dr. Kim said as he examined Eduardo's device. "This technology is 40 years ahead of anything currently in commercial use. The efficiency ratings alone would revolutionize the entire industry." Miguel proved invaluable in preparing for the press conference, his systematic mind helping organize evidence in ways that would be accessible to reporters and television audiences. His ability to understand complex technical concepts and explain them in simple language made him an ideal assistant for preparing visual presentations. "Miguel, can you show people how Eduardo's machine works differently from the bad companies?" "Machines?" Daniel asked as they practiced demonstration techniques. Miguel nodded seriously, setting up a side-by-side comparison that highlighted the dramatic differences in efficiency, cost, and environmental impact. His careful attention to detail ensured that every aspect of the demonstration would work flawlessly under the pressure of media scrutiny. But as their preparations intensified, so did Meridian's countermeasures. Daniel's school board received anonymous complaints about his unprofessional conduct and demands for investigation into his fitness as an educator. Elena faced similar pressure at the library, with city officials questioning her use of public resources for unauthorized research projects. The most serious escalation came on Thursday evening, when Daniel returned from school to find evidence of a break-in at the house. Nothing had been stolen, but Eduardo's workshop had been searched thoroughly, and several documents were out of place, despite Elena's careful organization system. "They're looking for something specific," Elena said, as they inventoried the disturbed materials. "Something they think we haven't found yet, or something they need to confirm we have discovered." Miguel examined the workshop with his characteristic attention to displaced details, eventually pointing to a section of stone wall that looked subtly different from his previous observations. "Dad, this part looks wrong, like someone moved the stones and put them back in different places." Daniel and Elena examined the area Miguel had identified, discovering that someone had attempted to access a section of Eduardo's hidden chambers. The intruders had been sophisticated enough to avoid obvious damage, but Miguel's pattern recognition had detected the subtle alterations that escaped adult notice. "They know about Eduardo's complete archive," Daniel realized. "They're trying to determine exactly what evidence we have, and whether there are additional materials they haven't accounted for." Friday morning brought the most direct threat yet, a visit from Richard Meridian III himself, accompanied by 2 corporate lawyers and a private security consultant whose presence seemed designed to intimidate rather than protect. "Mr. Reyes, I think we need to have an honest conversation about your situation," Meridian said, as Daniel met them at the front gate. His urbane demeanor couldn't disguise the cold calculation in his eyes as he assessed Daniel's determination. "I told you before, the property isn't for sale," Daniel replied, positioning himself to block any view of the house's interior where Miguel was completing his morning routine. "I'm not here to discuss real estate," Meridian said with a smile that held no warmth. "I'm here to discuss the serious legal consequences of possessing stolen corporate property and making false accusations against a respected business." The lawyers stepped forward with briefcases containing what appeared to be extensive legal documentation, clearly prepared to overwhelm Daniel with the threat of expensive litigation. "We have evidence that you've unlawfully appropriated proprietary technology belonging to Meridian Industries," one lawyer announced. "We're prepared to file criminal charges unless this matter is resolved immediately." Daniel felt his father's protective instincts surge as he thought about Miguel inside the house, unaware of the corporate threat gathering at their front gate. "I inherited this property legally. Everything in it belongs to me as the rightful heir. Everything except technology that was stolen from our company 70 years ago," Meridian replied smoothly. "Eduardo Mendoza was a disgraced engineer who attempted to claim credit for innovations developed by our research team. Any documentation or prototypes found on this property represent stolen intellectual property that must be returned immediately." The brazen revisionism of Meridian's claims would have been shocking if Daniel hadn't spent weeks studying Eduardo's evidence of exactly this kind of corporate gaslighting. Meridian's grandfather had perfected the technique of accusing victims of the crimes committed against them, and the family business had clearly passed this strategy down through generations. "I think this conversation is over," Daniel said firmly. "If you have legal concerns, you can address them through proper channels." As Meridian's entourage prepared to leave, the CEO leaned closer to Daniel with a final threat disguised as friendly. "Advice? You have a son, Mr. Reyes, a special needs child who depends on you for stability and security. It would be unfortunate if your misguided crusade disrupted the life you've built for him." Elena sat in Daniel's kitchen, surrounded by legal papers that seemed to multiply with each delivery from corporate law firms, her library science training proving invaluable for organizing the complex litigation strategy designed to overwhelm them with procedural complexity. "They're trying to bury us in paperwork," she said, reviewing the latest stack of court filings. 17 separate motions filed in 3 different jurisdictions, each one requiring detailed responses that could cost thousands of dollars in legal fees. But Eduardo's final preparations had anticipated exactly this corporate strategy. Hidden in the deepest chamber of his archive, Miguel discovered a collection of documents that had waited 70 years for their moment of relevance. Original patent applications filed in multiple states, corporate correspondence that proved premeditation, and most devastatingly, financial records showing bribes paid to patent office officials to delay Eduardo's filings. "Eduardo was brilliant," Elena said, examining documents that anticipated every legal argument Meridian might raise. "He documented not just the theft of his technology, but the corruption of the entire patent system that enabled it." Miguel proved invaluable in decoding the final layer of Eduardo's archive. His systematic mind recognized patterns in seemingly random document organization that revealed a hidden indexing system. Each legal challenge from Meridian triggered specific responses that Eduardo had prepared decades in advance. "Dad, Eduardo left us answers for all the bad company's questions," Miguel announced with satisfaction, arranging documents in sequences that matched Meridian's legal arguments. "He knew they would try to trick people with lawyer words." The community response to the press conference exceeded everyone's expectations. Environmental groups throughout the region organized protests at Meridian facilities, demanding explanations for water treatment failures that could have been prevented with Eduardo's suppressed technology. Social media amplified the story beyond local news coverage, attracting national attention to corporate crimes that represented a systemic pattern of technological suppression. Mrs. Chen emerged as an unexpected ally, organizing neighborhood support that provided practical assistance. During the legal siege, Esperanza was good woman who waited long time for justice, she told reporters who interviewed community members. Now family comes home to finish what should have been finished 70 years ago. But Meridian's counterattack escalated beyond legal maneuvering into personal intimidation that tested everyone's resolve. Elena received anonymous phone calls threatening her professional reputation, while Daniel faced pressure from school administrators who suggested his external controversies might affect his teaching position. The most serious escalation came Thursday evening when Daniel discovered evidence of surveillance equipment planted throughout his house during the previous week's break-in. Tiny cameras and listening devices hidden in electrical outlets and light fixtures revealed the scope of corporate espionage directed against his family. They've been monitoring our conversations for weeks, Daniel realized as he and Elena systematically removed the surveillance equipment. Every strategy session, every piece of evidence we've discussed, they've known about all of it. Miguel's unique sensitivity to environmental changes had detected the surveillance without understanding its significance. "Dad, the house sounds different now," he said, as they finished removing the last hidden microphone, "like it's breathing better." Friday brought the revelation that would transform their defensive legal battle into an offensive corporate investigation. Elena's research into Meridian's financial records revealed evidence of ongoing securities fraud that extended far beyond historical patent theft. "Look at this," she said, showing Daniel documents that proved Meridian had been systematically overcharging government contracts by claiming their inferior technology justified premium pricing. They've been defrauding federal agencies for decades by presenting stolen technology as proprietary innovation. The securities fraud evidence attracted federal attention that corporate lawyers couldn't intimidate or bribe. FBI investigators specializing in white-collar crime contacted Daniel's legal team with interest in Eduardo's archive as evidence for potential criminal charges against Meridian's executive leadership. "This isn't just civil litigation anymore," explained Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who had been investigating Meridian's government contracts for suspicious billing practices. "Eduardo's documentation provides the historical context we need to prove systematic criminal intent spanning multiple generations." Miguel's discovery of Eduardo's final letter provided the emotional foundation that transformed technical evidence into a compelling narrative of justice delayed but not denied. The letter, addressed to future generations who would possess the courage that circumstances denied to me, offered moral guidance for wielding the power that came with exposing corporate crimes. "I have preserved this evidence not for revenge, but for restoration," Eduardo's letter read. "Use this knowledge to ensure that technology serves humanity rather than corporate greed, that innovation benefits the many rather than enriching the few, that truth prevails over power, regardless of the cost." The letter's wisdom guided their response to Meridian's final desperate gambit, a settlement offer of $50 million in exchange for agreeing never to discuss Eduardo's technology or Meridian's historical crimes. The offer came with implied threats about the ongoing surveillance and intimidation that could escalate if they refused corporate generosity. Eduardo waited 70 years for justice, not money, Daniel told Meridian's representatives during a tense conference call. "His legacy isn't for sale to the people who destroyed his life." Elena's grandfather's story provided the personal motivation that sustained her through corporate pressure, designed to break individual resolve. Roberto Rodriguez had died carrying guilt for his role in Eduardo's destruction, but his granddaughter now had the opportunity to redeem his memory by exposing the corporate system that had exploited his desperation. "My grandfather was a good man who made a terrible choice under pressure he couldn't resist," Elena said during a television interview that aired Friday evening. "But his granddaughter won't make the same choice when faced with similar pressure." Some things matter more than personal security. The week's events culminated Saturday morning when federal agents executed search warrants at Meridian Industries headquarters, seizing corporate records that would either confirm or contradict Eduardo's 70-year-old accusations. The simultaneous raids at multiple facilities suggested coordinated criminal investigation that exceeded anything corporate lawyers had prepared to defend against. Miguel watched the television coverage with the satisfied expression he wore when complex puzzles resolved according to logical principles. Dad, the police are taking papers from the bad company's buildings. Does that mean Eduardo's story is winning? It means Eduardo's truth is finally being investigated by people who can't be intimidated or bought, Daniel replied, holding his son close as they witnessed justice emerging from decades of corporate suppression. Richard Meridian III's arrest on federal charges that evening provided symbolic closure to a conflict that had begun with his grandfather's theft of Eduardo's life's work. The family business built on stolen innovation would now face criminal accountability that corporate lawyers couldn't prevent through legal manipulation. Justice delayed is not justice denied, Daniel quoted from Eduardo's letter as news reports showed Meridian being led away in handcuffs. Sometimes it just takes 3 generations to find the right moment for truth to emerge. Elena smiled through tears that reflected both relief and vindication for her grandfather's memory. Roberto Rodriguez's granddaughter helped expose the truth he was too afraid to reveal. Maybe that redeemed some of the damage his silence enabled. As they sat in Eduardo's kitchen that evening, surrounded by evidence that had finally achieved its purpose after 70 years of patient waiting, Daniel felt the weight of generational responsibility transforming into the satisfaction of ancestral vindication. Eduardo's technology would soon be available to communities that had suffered from inferior water treatment systems. His reputation would be restored to its rightful place in engineering history, and his faith in family courage would be validated by descendants who had proven worthy of his trust. The broken mansion on Elmwood Drive had fulfilled its purpose as a sanctuary for suppressed truth and a foundation for delayed justice. What had begun as an inheritance of problems had become a legacy of solutions that would benefit generations yet to come. 6 months after the press conference that exposed 70 years of corporate crime, the mansion on Elmwood Drive stood transformed from a symbol of decay into a beacon of community renewal. The roof had been restored with period-appropriate materials, the foundation crack sealed with modern techniques that preserved the building's architectural integrity, and the windows that had been boarded up for decades now welcomed morning light into rooms designed for learning and discovery. The Eduardo Mendoza Foundation occupied the mansion's restored spaces, serving as both a museum of technological innovation and an active research center, where Eduardo's water purification systems were being developed for contemporary applications. Daniel's inheritance had provided the financial foundation for the transformation, while federal restitution payments from Meridian Industries' criminal settlement supplied ongoing operational funding. Miguel moved through the renovated rooms with the confident familiarity of someone whose unique needs had been considered in every design decision. His sensory swing hung from the reinforced ceiling beam in what had once been Esperanza's formal living room, now converted into a therapeutic space where other children with autism came for specialized educational programs. "Dad, the house likes having people in it again," Miguel announced as he arranged his stone collection in the built-in shelving that Eduardo had installed nearly a century earlier. "It doesn't feel lonely anymore." Daniel smiled at his son's observation, understanding that the mansion's transformation reflected more than architectural restoration. The building had reclaimed its purpose as a place where innovation served community welfare, where families gathered to learn and grow, where the future was planned with consideration for justice and environmental protection. Elena emerged from Eduardo's restored workshop, now equipped with modern laboratory equipment alongside the original tools that had created revolutionary technology 8 decades earlier. Her position as the Foundation's Director of Historical Research had provided career redemption after Meridian's campaign to destroy her professional reputation, and her daily work honored both Eduardo's legacy and her grandfather's memory. The University has agreed to partner with us on developing Eduardo's designs for contemporary water treatment applications, she announced, reviewing correspondence that had arrived that morning. Dr. Kim will lead the engineering team, and we'll have access to federal funding for communities affected by contamination that Meridian's systems couldn't address. The partnership represented more than technical collaboration. It signified academic recognition of Eduardo's contributions to engineering science and official acknowledgement of injustices that had been covered up for 3 generations. Engineering. Textbooks would soon include Eduardo's innovations alongside other pioneers whose work had advanced human welfare. Richard Meridian III's conviction on federal racketeering charges had triggered a cascade of legal consequences that dismantled the corporate empire built on stolen technology. Meridian Industries faced billions in restitution payments to communities whose water supplies had been contaminated by inferior treatment systems, while corporate assets were liquidated to compensate inventors whose work had been appropriated through systematic intellectual property theft. 37 separate inventors have been identified as victims of Meridian's theft operations, Eleanor reported, reading from Justice Department documents that detailed the scope of corporate crime enabled by Eduardo's suppression. The total financial impact of stolen innovation exceeds $2 billion, not including environmental damage that could have been prevented. Mrs. Chen had become the Foundation's volunteer coordinator, organizing community programs that served the immigrant families and elderly residents who had been priced out of water treatment upgrades by Meridian's monopolistic pricing. Her small apartment overflowed with thank-you letters from families whose children could finally drink clean water without fear of contamination-related illness. Esperanza waited 70 years to see this day, Mrs. Chen said, as she watched children play in the mansion's restored garden, where Miguel had designed accessible pathways that accommodated wheelchairs and sensory processing needs. Now neighborhood has hope again, instead of just broken dreams. Daniel's return to teaching had been triumphal rather than routine. Roosevelt Elementary had invited him to develop environmental science curriculum based on Eduardo's technology, creating hands-on learning experiences that showed students how innovation could solve real-world problems affecting their own communities. Mr. Reyes, when can we visit the water treatment plant that uses Eduardo's machines? Asked Maria, one of Daniel's 4th-grade students, whose family had been affected by contamination from the old Meridian facility. Next month, Daniel replied, reviewing field trip permissions that would take his class to the pilot installation, where Eduardo's technology was being tested for municipal applications. You'll see how 70-year-old innovations are helping solve problems that modern engineering couldn't address. The pilot plant represented the culmination of Eduardo's vision, community-scale water treatment that provided superior results at affordable costs, accessible to low-income neighborhoods that had been underserved by corporate systems designed for maximum profit rather than maximum benefit. Miguel had become an unexpected ambassador for neurodiversity awareness, his role in exposing Eduardo's legacy demonstrating how different ways of thinking could contribute essential insights to complex problems. Special education programs throughout the region had adopted teaching methods that celebrated systematic thinking and pattern recognition as valuable cognitive gifts, rather than limitations requiring correction. Miguel's brain works like Eduardo's brain, Dr. Patricia Williams explained to parents during a conference on autism and innovation. Both of them see details and connections that neurotypical thinking might miss. That's not a disability. It's a cognitive advantage that can lead to revolutionary breakthroughs. The afternoon brought a ceremony that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. The unveiling of a bronze plaque outside the mansion, recognizing Eduardo Mendoza as a pioneer of environmental engineering whose innovations continue to serve community welfare. City officials, who had ignored Eduardo's persecution 8 decades earlier, now competed to associate themselves with his restored reputation. Elena's research had revealed Eduardo's complete story, tracing his family's immigration from Mexico, his exceptional academic achievements despite discrimination, and his development of technology that was decades ahead of its time. The narrative of persecution and vindication had become a case study in engineering ethics programs nationwide. Eduardo represents both the promise and the vulnerability of innovation in corporate-dominated societies, Dr. Kim said during the dedication ceremony. His technology could have prevented countless environmental disasters, but corporate greed suppressed it for 70 years. Now we have the opportunity to ensure that innovation serves humanity rather than private profit. Miguel's speech at tea. The ceremony surprised adults who had underestimated his ability to articulate complex emotional concepts. Standing beside Eduardo's bronze portrait, he addressed the gathered crowd with the moral clarity that had characterized his understanding of their family's mission. Eduardo waited a long time for people to know he was a good inventor who wanted to help everybody have clean water, Miguel said, his clear voice carrying across the garden where Eduardo and Maria had once planned their future together. Now, everybody knows Eduardo was brave and smart, and his machines can help people who need clean water but can't pay lots of money for it. As evening settled over Elmwood Drive, Daniel sat in Eduardo's restored kitchen reading bedtime stories to Miguel, while Elena organized Foundation correspondence at the table where they had first decoded Eduardo's hidden archive. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with purpose and possibility. The letter that arrived that afternoon brought news that would have astounded Eduardo. The Nobel Committee for Chemistry had announced a special recognition for foundational innovations in environmental technology that acknowledged his contributions to water purification science. The honor would be presented posthumously, with Daniel accepting on behalf of the family whose courage had restored Eduardo's legacy. Eduardo's story shows that truth eventually prevails over power, but only when people have the courage to seek justice despite personal risk, Daniel reflected as he tucked Miguel into bed in the room that had once been Eduardo's study. Your great-great-great-grandfather would be proud of how brave you were in helping him tell his story. Miguel nodded solemnly, understanding that their family's journey from struggling teachers to protectors of inherited justice represented more than personal transformation. Dad, when I grow up, I want to invent things like Eduardo did, but I want to make sure nobody can steal them from me. Daniel smiled at his son's determination, seeing Eduardo's innovative spirit combined with hard-won wisdom about protecting creative work from corporate predation. You'll invent amazing things, buddy, and this time we'll know how to keep them safe for everyone who needs them. As Daniel turned off the lights in the restored mansion, he felt the presence of generations watching over their transformed legacy. Eduardo's technology would soon provide clean water for communities throughout the region. His reputation had been restored to its rightful place in engineering history, and his faith in family courage had been validated by descendants who had proven worthy of his trust. The broken house on Elmwood Drive had become what Eduardo had always intended, a foundation for innovation that served humanity, a sanctuary for truth that could not be suppressed, and a home where the future was built with consideration for justice, environmental protection, and the welfare of generations yet to come. Outside, the neighborhood that had once mocked Daniel's foolish optimism now looked toward the mansion with respect and gratitude. The house that everyone said could never be fixed had become the heart of community renewal, proving that broken things could indeed become beautiful again when approached with patience, determination, and faith in the possibility of redemption. Eduardo Mendoza's legacy would continue through the technology that bore his name, the foundation that preserved his vision, and the family who had transformed inheritance of problems into inheritance of solutions that would benefit humanity for generations to come.